So, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to this now quite regular series of Lux Talks. David Shirres, he's nominally our secretary, but he's doing a hell of a lot else besides under these strange times. He's going to talk to us about the canals that never were, which is a slightly daunting title when you think there's an infinite number of canals that never were. But fortunately, he's going to restrict himself to the ones for which proposals were actually written down. And I will steal no more of his thunder than and just introduce him. David, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, let's see if I can crank this thing up. Yeah, I should say, Mike, an infinite number, but I'm not going to talk for that long. You'll be pleased to know. Thanks everybody for coming along. This presentation's kind of inspired by the work that I did with the Digital Art Group, and thanks particularly to Jim Loney, who gave me a huge amount of information, which was quite something to digest, and I found it quite fascinating doing so. And in doing so, I hope you'll find it equally of interest. So to kick off, I'm confining myself to central Scotland. I hope I've got everything, but if not, please feel free to tell me afterwards. And essentially the areas I'd like to cover tonight are getting between the seas, bypassing the Clyde, and getting coal to Edinburgh, which really is the big part of the story. But then I'd like to touch on the pre-World War I naval arms race, which we'll see was relevant. But we'll touch on that later. But let's talk about between the seas. And there's been talk since Charles II's time of somehow navigating boats across Scotland. And in 1763, as you can see, Smeaton was asked to look into this. Smeaton was one of the engineering greats around that time. And it's quite amazing what these people did in their time. For example, he developed the lift equation that the Wright brothers used for their first flight, which is, I always find that sort of thing quite fascinating, what people actually did. But his first proposal to get between the two seas was to actually go north. And as you can see, make the rivers Forth, Hendrick and Leven navigable with a short canal between the Forth and Hendrick. And that would get you quite nicely between the two seas. And we'll come back to that route later. His second proposal was quite a shallow canal, which would reach the Clyde around Yoker. And those were his first two proposals, which it's fair to say weren't really greeted with acclaim, because the Glasgow merchants were firstly outraged by his first proposal that went nowhere near Glasgow. And his second proposal went out at Yoker, which at the time was quite a bit outside Glasgow. So it didn't really go to Glasgow. It was also quite a shallow canal, so it wasn't going to carry much. And there was a lot of debate about this. And the other thing that's really worth noting at that stage, and we'll come to this later, is that at that time, upstream of Bowling, the Clyde was only maybe 3 or 4 feet deep. It really couldn't carry any ships at all. So a deep canal really wasn't much use because you wouldn't be able to get it up the Clyde. But there was a lots of discussion and arguing, and eventually we got the proposal for the Forth and Clyde Canal, which we know today, which would have a branch into Glasgow, and it would have to go up the Clyde as far as Bowling to get ships out to sea, and there were seagoing ships at the time. This is a canal that was built, but I'll touch on it briefly. As we probably, most of us know, it started in 1768 and was built from east to west, so it could get money as they were building it. Money ran out in 1777 by the time it got to Glasgow. And then a new engineer was appointed, Robert Whitworth, who we'll come to later, who then extended it from Glasgow to Bowling between 1784 and 1790. And as with all big and major projects, it cost twice as much as its estimates. And that was the Forth and Clyde Canal. And everyone was quite happy with that, except for the citizens of Bowness, because they quite rightly saw that with the canal finishing up at Grangemouth, it would rather detract from Bowness. And as can be seen on that slide, their fears were realised because the amount of traffic in Bowness dramatically dropped as Grangemouth became established. What they tried to do was to get a canal built between Grangemouth and Bowness to avert that commercial catastrophe for them, but it was just too expensive and they couldn't afford it. Some work was done on it and it was then abandoned. And if you look at John Thompson's county map of Linlithgowshire of 1820, as you can see at the bottom there, it shows the Bowness Canal partly built. And if you look at Google Maps, you can see the line of those works. And in fact, if you go along there today, you could take a photograph of what just looks like a ditch, but was in fact the works for the Bowness Canal. And perhaps even more interesting is that the aqueduct that was to be built over the River Avon was in fact built. James Watt was the surveyor, and that aqueduct has now been converted into the road bridge today. So that is one of the few canals that were never built that was actually partially built. But as I say, sadly, the citizens of Bowness didn't get their canal and their traffic declined as a result. Another proposal, as late on as 1835, was a canal to Stirling, which was estimated to cost £90,000. But they couldn't raise the subscriptions for it, although the Forth and Clyde had agreed to contribute about 50 grand to it. They just couldn't get enough money for that. It's quite interesting to me that as late as 1835, people were proposing canals when it was just at the start of the railway age. But there you go. And just to complete the picture for central Scotland, the Monkland Canal, again surveyed by James Watt, who is more known for his steam engines, of course. And the first bit was the easy bit, which was a level bit. That was opened in 1773, but then it took a while before anything else happened. And it was only in 1790 that it was finally completed by being joined to the Forth and Clyde and being extended at the western end. And what was interesting to me when I did this research, and some people may well know this, is that at the western end of the first 7 miles was the Black Hill Locks, because there was quite a drop there. And that was the only place in Scotland where there was actually an inclined plane. And that inclined plane at Black Hill is now under the junction of the M8 and the M80. Of course, as most people will probably know, the Monkland Canal is mainly under the M8 today. So let's move away from central Scotland a bit to the Clyde. As I say, the Clyde around 1800 time was very, very shallow. That's why at Port Glasgow, at the upper reaches of the Clyde, all the ships arrived and very little could go upriver to Glasgow because it was very shallow. And so there was a proposal made to build a canal between Ardrossan and Glasgow to take goods in that way. But of course, money was a problem, and there was only sufficient funds to build that canal between Glasgow and Johnson. It had a very busy passenger service, but despite that, like a lot of canals, it wasn't a commercial success, and it was converted to a railway. And one of the legacies of that is, I think, the world's oldest currently used railway bridge is over the River Whitecart just outside Paisley, because that was a canal bridge that was converted to a railway line built in 1819. If anybody knows of an older railway bridge currently in use, please let me know. So moving on to our part of the world, but just before I do, just to summarize, so that's the situation in 1812, pretty much canals built and proposed. And where do we go from there? Well, clearly Edinburgh's not part of that. And we'll come to Edinburgh soon, but just before we do, just one thing to point out, which I find quite amazing, was just what a blank canvas the canal builders had. There's a map of about 1790 of the Forth and Clyde Canal joining the Forth. And as you can see, there's really nothing there other than the canal, a tiny hamlet at Falkirk, a slightly smaller one at Camlin. And apart from some of the landed estates, there wasn't really anything in the canal builder's way. They had lots of other challenges to face, but they essentially had a blank canvas, which is interesting when we come to think what might have been. But let's get to Edinburgh, because Edinburgh was suffering from a lack of cheap coal, and that was actually a huge issue for Edinburgh, that was getting all its coal through Leith and were being ripped off. They engaged in 1793, a committee was formed to see how we could get coal by canal from the Lanarkshire coalfields. And Robert Whitworth, who was the engineer at the end of the building of the Forth and Clyde Canal, and John Ainsley, a well-known surveyor who had drawn a lot of maps at the time, were engaged to consider various options. And they considered 4 routes as to how you can get a canal from Edinburgh to the Lanarkshire coalfields. These are named pretty much all after places that don't exist today. Lingore was a moss, and that's one of the routes. It went all the way to Leith and connected to the Monkland Canal, and it had a summit of 785 feet. If we think that roughly every 10 feet there would have been a lock, we can imagine how many locks there would have been on that canal. Another proposal, Baton Moss, summit was slightly lower at 774 feet, and the Badlorney line lower still at 629 feet. But perhaps the best of them all was the Wilson Town line, which went by Cobbenshaw Lock and had a summit of 873 feet, which would have been about 170 locks. The idea that anybody could even think of building a canal with 170 locks between Edinburgh and the Lanarkshire coalfields just shows what the case was for getting that coal. And really quite amazing that people should be proposing such canals, but that was very much what was built. So having actually got those proposals, then what? Well, the subscribers decided that they would engage John Rennie, another great, very versatile guy who had done all manner of engineering, and he produced 2 reports, one in 1797 and one in 1798, to see what the way forward would be. The reports looked at the various routes and proposed various suggestions. He also reviewed where the coal was and where the minerals were and whatnot. And he very firmly rejected the Wilson Town line, though he had no hesitation in stating that this was not in the interests of subscribers to adopt. There wasn't water for it, as well as its cost, and that was the one he definitely ruled out. But he felt that the others should be still considered, subject to certain alterations. The other thing he did, he proposed his own line. He proposed a new level line on the 274-foot contour that was going to take a line to the north. So it wasn't actually going to go through any known coalfields at the time, but it would get quicker to the Lanarkshire coalfields and it wouldn't involve any locks. When he proposed that, it would start off the Badlorney line, so there would still be a 77-foot drop from there to Edinburgh. And that was his 1797 report. And then he went away and thought for another 13 months and came back with his October 1798 report. In that report, he'd extended his northern line on the level into Edinburgh and taken it down to Leith. He'd also considered that the Lingore line was not at all suitable, because with improvements to the Baton Moss line, then that was a far better route. So it was left with 3 proposals at that stage. And he did all manner of analysis in terms of what was needed and how much money would come in, and how long it would take. He looked, if we took at that chart at the bottom there, he looked at, for example, how many locks there were. I think he assumed 6 minutes a lock, which is actually going some, but there you go, and 2.5 miles an hour. And it would take you about either 23.5 or 27.5 hours to get to the coal fields. And he looked at the various costs and options, and he came to the conclusion that there was plenty of water for all the 3 lines. If you're going to choose between the Baton Moss and the Badloney line, it really depended where the coal was, and at that stage, it wasn't that well known where a lot of the coal was. It was known that there was some coal at Houston around Upall, but other than that, all the coal, known coal, was in the Lanarkshire area. As well as the ironstone and the other minerals. And also the land prices weren't that known. But subject to land prices, he recommended that what was needed was his level line, because that favoured large boats, and also it would offer passenger traffic, which would just not be feasible on all these little lines with sort of locks. So there it was. That was the situation in 1798 with Renning's reports. And then came the Napoleonic Wars, which was the situation 200 years ago, probably equivalent to the pandemic and Brexit combined. It was an utter disaster economically, and everything sort of ground to a halt for quite a period of time. But come about 1813, there was a very, very bad winter, high coal prices, and also coal had been discovered in the north part of central Scotland, around Stirlingshire and Fife and such like. So there wasn't really any point in building a hugely expensive canal with 170 locks or whatever to get from Edinburgh to the Lanarkshire coalfields. So that really made Rennie's line attractive, but was it the best line? Because it wasn't really intended to, it was a 274-foot contour, so you could get to the Monklands coalfield, and was that necessary? So enter Hugh Baird, who proposed a line on the 240-foot contour, one that we're all quite familiar with, because that's our canal, and that's the proposal that Baird put forward. And then enter Stevenson. Stevenson had made a suggestion that there should be a canal 85 foot lower than Baird's, and he could make that a level canal. And the city asked him to produce a report on that, which he duly did. And Stevenson, again, one of these people who had just done so much, better known for his lighthouses, but did quite a bit of civil engineering. And also his family became a veritable engineering dynasty. And his report, there's his canal, and there's what he proposed. And you could see it was a brilliant idea, having a dead level canal all the way from the centre of Edinburgh. In fact, at the bottom of the Norlock, where Waverley Station is today, was to be the main basin. And it was a great idea having a level canal, but there was a slight snag in that it involved a 3-mile long tunnel at Winchborough. Stephen stressed that the huge benefits of a level canal easily justified the cost of the tunnel. He claimed that building the tunnel wouldn't be a problem, it would just cost a lot of money, and it would bring all the traffic in because it was so level, and there should be no ideas or fear of apprehension connected with the tunnel. A significant part of his report is devoted to what to do about passengers being afraid going through the tunnel, which I think was quite interesting. He points out that a lower canal is better to get access to coal and such like, because you'll be loading it downhill into the canal. And his route went to Lock 20, as you can see at the far end, on the Forth and Clyde Canal. And Lock 20 is where the summit pond of the Forth and Clyde Canal starts. So that gives you a level route all the way from Princess Street Gardens right through to Port Dundas in Glasgow. He offered 2 routes to Leith, because the original route that was proposed about 10 or 15 years ago was starting to get built up. And he also proposed an extension from Port Dundas to the Broomielaw in Glasgow, because at about that time, the Clyde had started to be becoming, there'd been dredging done, and the Clyde was much more deeply. And he made the point that his proposal would very much benefit Edinburgh, because that would then mean that all the traffic from the east ports and from Europe that was going through the canal to Glasgow would go via Leith instead of Grangemouth, and that was a good thing. So that was Stevenson's very thorough report and proposal, and he also, his estimate is there, as you can see, £132,000 for the cost of the tunnel, which was a very substantial part of his £400,000 for the level canal, for which another £90,000 or so was needed to get to the North Bridge. His proposal of £400,000 for that level canal, 34 miles long, compares with Baird's estimate of £240,000 for a 31-mile canal, although that, again, a bit like the Forth and Clyde, actually finished up costing twice as much, ironically, because there was a need for a tunnel. So now it's decision time. But before we talk about decision time, let's just consider the actual lines of these canals. One of the things that I found as a bit of a treasure trove, actually, when I was researching this, is the National Library of Scotland's electronic maps, which some people may be familiar with, but it's a beautiful thing to browse through. And I came across John Thompson's Atlas of Edinburghshire, which was published in 1821, and that had drawn on it the lines of the 3 canals, which was quite interesting to see exactly where they went. There's Edinburgh up there. You can see our canal in blue, Baird's line. There's Rennie's line, which has to take a dog leg around Ratho, and Stevenson's line starting off going through Princess Street Gardens, over the top of Haymarket Station, following mainly the line of the railway line on the east side. And if we go a bit further on the further west, you can see how there's his 3-mile long tunnel. What I find quite interesting with that is that Stevenson's line goes under Baird's line just about at Broxburn, which is actually quite a level area. So that implies that to get his tunnel, he would need a cutting about 80 feet deep at that point, which is actually shown on his plan, to be fair. But there's a fair bit of earthworks involved in that. And of course, when we get to Linlithgow, he goes around the north of the lock, whereas Rennie is a bit further to the south than our canal. And if we look at what that means for Edinburgh, or what could have meant for Edinburgh, again, quite interesting to think what might have been in Edinburgh. The blue line is Baird's line, and there's the canal that was actually built. This is from a 1817 map of Edinburgh I found that again showed the lines of all the canal. And that map actually shows Hugh Baird's line being extended to Leith, which is quite interesting because as far as all the other information I have, Baird never proposed taking the canal to Leith, but it's shown on that map. There's Stevenson's line, which goes into where Waverley Station is today, and then follows Rennie's line down to Leith. But he actually offered another line to Leith, which wasn't quite so built up. And one of the earlier proposals, the Lingore line to get to Leith, actually tunnelled underneath Hanover Street before leaving Edinburgh. So quite interesting to think if any of those canals have been built into Edinburgh and along the bottom of Princess Street Gardens, just how Edinburgh might have looked today and how future infrastructure development, like railways, for example, would have been affected. Because that's pretty much the location of Haymarket Station where those 2 canals, 2 options meet just there. And just looking at that in a bit more detail, overlaid on today's map, as you can see, there's Stevenson's line, there's Rennie's line around the top of the meadows, a series of locks there going down past Arthur's Seat. And as I say, I just think it's quite interesting what might have happened if any of those had been built. And let's look at Linlithgow, our own hometown. There's an enlargement. One thing I found quite interesting when you try to translate these is that the blue line there is the actual Union Canal. The dotted line is what's actually shown on the map. So it's not quite precise, and no doubt there were minor changes made as they actually built them. And if we actually look at that on a modern map, we can see where things would be. Rennie's line is just south of Clarendon Road and goes right through the top of the quarry at Kettleston, and they would have had to have dug into that quarry. That would have been quite difficult and challenging. And we can see where Stevenson's line went to the north there. So again, quite interesting where they would have taken. But which line to choose? Well, we know which line to choose. It was Baird's line. So looking, 1817 was a time for decision. And it was quite a rapid decision, actually, because it was all very controversial. There was quite a lot of feeling against Baird's line because some people felt it would benefit Grangemouth rather than Leith. The good folk of Leith certainly, and most people in Scotland wanted a canal that went to Leith, but the practicalities of that and the cost of that in terms of water was just too much. So Stevenson offered his report on the 17th of February, but barely after a month later, in Parliament, there was a bill proposing Baird's route. And that went through Parliament remarkably quickly. In just 3 months, that bill got royal assent, so things could get started. And essentially, Baird's line was chosen because Rennie's line to Mulklands was no longer relevant after the coal finds in Stirlingshire. Stevenson's tunnel was considered to be far too expensive and risky. If we go back to Maureen's presentation last week about the tunnel under the Pennines, that took, I think it was about 15 years to build with enormous difficulties, and they would have been well aware of that. And despite all the strong support for Leith, it was just too expensive and just not practical. So that gives us the actual canal. And that's the background to the construction of our canal. One minor thing that wasn't built, as is well known, our canal tunnel is as a result of an objection from the Forbes estate at Callander. That's what, in blue, what would have been built, again on another old map. And that map actually shows Stevenson's line as being lowered to connect with Baird's line. For whatever reason, I'm not so sure, but interesting again. I can't see he would have ever got that built because that would have gone right past Callander House. But it's quite interesting to note that had it not been for that forced diversion, there would have been a basin for the canal pretty much right in the centre of Falkirk. So then the railways came. There's a photograph of Linlithgow taken in 1845, which is perhaps the world's first photograph of a railway station. And of course, now the railways came, nobody needs canals, and there's not going to be any more canal proposals. Except that wasn't quite the case, because we have to consider strategic issues, and Germany's got a bigger canal anyway. There's one of the German dreadnought battleships going through the Kiel Canal. And that led to a lot of serious thinking about a battleship canal in Scotland. And quite interesting there were two proposals. Getting back to Smeaton's original line, there was a proposal to build a very large canal to connect to the Loch Lomond. Although there was talk of leaving through Leven, the preferred option was to leave into Loch Long at Tarbert. Or the alternative was to follow something very close to the Forth and Clyde Canal with locks at Glasgow. The early proposals for that actually didn't have locks. They felt they could just build it on a level. Then someone pointed out there was a significant tidal difference between the Forth and the Clyde, so you clearly do need a lock. So a bit of background to that. Another factor was that in 1884, the Manchester Ship Canal opened, which proved, in a sense, that sort of thing could be done. And it was in 1889 that Stephenson's company proposed a ship canal via Loch Lomond. And then there was this counter proposal from Yoker to Grangemouth. And the canal had a lot of support from certainly the Admiralty and the Great and the Good, who felt that they needed to move their fleet, the British fleet, rapidly from the Atlantic to the North Sea to deal with any potential threat. It was also considered to have quite a strong commercial case, as we'll see. It was initially of a 26-foot draft, but the final proposal was for a 43-foot draft. After World War II, when ships had been based at Scapa Flow that could then go either down the east or the west side, it was found that the strategic case wasn't so strong, but there were still various proposals commercially to build this canal. But perhaps the best chance for that happening was pre-First World War, but that was completely lost because there was huge rivalry between the competing factions over what canal should be built, and nobody could agree which was the best canal, so they never built a canal. And to give an idea of what the canal would have looked like, we'll go on to the next slide, but before we do, just considering the commercial case for the canal, there was a chart that was produced to show the actual mileages that you could save, and there was certainly between the wars a significant amount of coastal shipping that would have saved significant differences, and the proposers estimated that the canal would have about 23 million gross tons going through it. What the economic case is for that, I'm not so sure, but it does show certainly quite a significant case. There's some cross sections for it. And whilst it's a relatively short distance, the route between Stirling and Loch Lomond at one stage is 267 feet above sea level. So you can see the sort of cuttings that will be involved. It would have had an air draft of 120 feet. Some fairly substantial bridges and things will be required. And so there's a bit of detail about the cost and the length of that canal. I actually traced out on my mapping app the sort of gradient profile, if you like, which shows that's why you need that 260 feet deep cutting thereabouts. The direct route was shorter, but much more expensive because there was much more of it above the 100 feet contour. It needed a huge amount of river dredging in the Clyde and huge amount more costings. The Lomond route and the 1947 estimate was 33 million, which, as you can see there, would have been 13 billion. And that's for a canal 45 feet deep, 120 feet air draft, and 150 feet bottom width. So really quite an enormous thing. An interesting what if. So that just about brings me to the end of the presentation. Interesting to consider what might have been. Where would the railway station have gone had Stephenson's proposal have happened? We could have had cruise ships on Loch Lomond passing Stirling and such like. Maybe Bowness would have had a oil refinery if it could have retained its predominance over Grangemouth. We could have had the UK's highest canal at Cobbinshore. I think the Huddersfield Canal gets up to about 650 feet. That would have been 850 feet. And the Lux Basin would have been much closer to my house as well, just further up Mance Road. So, and maybe lots and lots of other things as well. It's always interesting to look back and see what if, but we've got a pretty good canal as we have it. And with that, that just about concludes my presentation, folks. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.